On June 22, 2011, the afternoon sun in Santa Monica made long shadows across the parking garage of the Princess Eugenia Apartments. For 16 years, this moment was sure to happen. Yet, when it finally came, it seemed almost like a letdown. Man walking slowly toward the white car, his arm around an older woman with light blonde hair, looked nothing like the scary crime boss who had once ruled Boston's world of crime with total control. James Whitey Bulger Jr. was 81 years old. His hair was all white, and his face had deep wrinkles from many years of fighting, being betrayed, and running from the law. The woman next to him, Catherine Grieg, had been his loyal friend through their years as the most wanted people in America. They had lived a quiet life in this California town by the sea. They were just another old couple, buying food at the local stores, taking walks in the evening, and not being noticed even though they were right there. But a man like Whitey Bulger could not stay hidden forever. FBI Special Agent Scott Garriola walked toward the couple with a calm he had practiced. His hand was resting on his gun, but not pulled out. Behind him, a team of agents moved to their spots, blocking all ways to escape. For 16 years, the FBI had hunted this man, which was strange. The same group that had once protected him, that had made it so no one could touch him, that had allowed him to rule through fear across Boston's South Shore. James Bulger. Garriola's voice cut through the California afternoon. The old man stopped walking. For a moment, his light blue eyes, those same cold, smart eyes that had been the last thing many of his victims had seen, met the agent's eyes. There was no surprise there, no fear, only a kind of tired feeling, as if he had always known this day would come. "You know who I am," he replied quietly. And with those words, one of the most unusual lives of crime in American history finally came to an end. But to understand how that moment in Santa Monica happened, we must go back more than 80 years, too. The tough streets of South Boston, where a young boy named Jimmy Bulger first learned that in his neighborhood, only the strong made it. Before we learn more about this amazing true story, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Put your city and what time it is for you in the comments below. If you're getting comfortable for this whole trip through, one of America's most surprising crime stories, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Give this video a like if you're ready for the real story about Whitey Bulger, and share it with anyone who loves true crime. This is a story everyone needs to hear. The year was 1929, and America was heading toward the Great Depression when James Joseph Bulger Jr. was born in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. His family would soon move to South Boston, Southie to the people who lived there, a close, working-class Irish neighborhood that would shape who he was and his life of crime. Southie in the 1930s was its own world. It was a place where being loyal meant everything and betraying someone meant death. The neighborhood was on a piece of land sticking out into Boston Harbor, separate from the rest of the city by water, and also in its way of thinking. Here, Irish. Families had made their own area, with its own rules, its own ideas of honor, and its own way of handling problems. The Bulger family lived in a small apartment in the Old Harbor Housing Project, one of the first government-built housing places in the United States. James Bulger Sr. worked as a longshoreman on the docks when there was work, which was not often during those hard years. Jean Bulger, Jimmy's mother, held the family together with strong will and her Catholic faith, raising 6 children on whatever money her husband could bring home. Young Jimmy Bulger was the second oldest child, but he soon showed he was the strongest personality of all the children. Even as a boy, he had a strange mix of smarts and toughness that made him different from other kids. While other children played normal childhood games, Jimmy was already studying how power and control worked in Southie. The most important relationship in young Jimmy's life was with his younger brother William, known as Billy. Where Jimmy was dark-haired and serious, Billy was light-haired and friendly. Where Jimmy solved problems with his fists, Billy used his words. The two brothers would stay close their whole lives, even as their lives went in very different directions. Jimmy went toward a life of crime, while Billy went toward politics and being respected. But it was the lessons of Southie itself that would be most important for the future crime boss. In this closed-off neighborhood, there were only two kinds of people: those who belonged and those who didn't. Family came first, then the neighborhood, then your group. The police were outsiders and were not to be trusted. Problems were solved inside the community, usually with violence. And most of all, you never, ever worked with the police. You never became a rat. This rule of silence, this wall of protection around the neighborhood, created the perfect place for organized crime to grow. Young Jimmy Bulger learned these lessons completely, understanding right away that the man who could control these loyalties, who could make himself the neighborhood's protector while secretly hurting it, could have a huge amount of power. By the time Jimmy Bulger was a teenager, the signs of his future were already there. He was smart. Teachers noticed his quick mind and his skill at changing situations to get what he wanted. He was charming. Other kids were naturally drawn to him, following his lead even when it got them into trouble. And he had no problem doing what it took to get what he wanted. His first arrests came in the 1940s. They were for small crimes that showed he had bigger plans, like stealing, fighting, and causing trouble. These were the kinds of things that were common for young men in Southie, but Jimmy seemed to get arrested for them more than usual. What was more troubling was that he did not seem to feel sorry. While other young criminals might show they were ashamed or promised to be better, Jimmy Bulger seemed to see his arrests as just part of the game, small delays in a bigger plan. A big change came in 1950 when 21-year-old Jimmy Bulger and two partners in crime tried to rob the Melrose Trust Company. The robbery was a failure from the start. The men went into the bank wearing fake mustaches and sunglasses that made them look more like stage performers than serious criminals. They asked for money from the bank tellers, but had not planned how they would get away. In a few minutes, the police had surrounded the building, and the men who wanted the bank robbers found themselves trapped. Jimmy's two partners panicked, but Jimmy himself stayed calm, almost like he was studying the situation. He looked at where the police were, thought about their choices, and in the end, he worked out a deal for them to give up. Even when he failed, he was learning, saving lessons about planning, about having backup plans, and about how important it was to control everything. The attempted bank robbery got Jimmy a 5-year sentence in a federal prison. But instead of staying in a local prison, where he could have kept his ties to Southie, he was sent to the most feared prison in America, Alcatraz. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was on a rocky island in San Francisco Bay, a strong prison made to hold America's most dangerous criminals. For Jimmy Bulger, arriving there in 1956, it was like going to a top school for crime. The prison had fewer than 300 prisoners, but they were the best of the criminal world. Bank robbers, murderers, leaders of organized crime, and escape artists. They were men who had reached the top of their illegal jobs before being caught by the police. For a young criminal like Bulger, who had big plans but was still learning his job, Alcatraz was a chance like no other to study under the masters of crime. Bulger got used to prison life with his usual smarts. He was not a leader or a follower among the prisoners, but something more dangerous, a watcher and a student. He watched how the powerful criminals kept their control, how they made friends, and how they dealt with anyone who challenged their power. He studied the guards, learning their daily plans, their weaknesses, and how they could be bribed. Most importantly, he learned about the feelings of fear and respect. At Alcatraz, what people thought of you was everything. A man's word was his promise, and breaking that promise was punished quickly and harshly. But Bulger also saw how some prisoners used violence in a smart way, not as a last option, but as a planned way to stay in control. During his time on the Rock, Bulger also took part in CIA tests with LSD and other drugs. The government was doing secret studies on mind control and using prisoners as test subjects without them knowing. This experience would later make Bulger very worried about government spying, but it also gave him direct knowledge of mind game tricks that he would later use against his enemies. Bulger's time at Alcatraz ended in 1962, right before the famous prison closed forever. He had been in prison for 6 years and came out a totally changed man. The young, sometimes quick-to-act criminal who had messed up a bank robbery had been replaced by a cold, smart predator who understood that the key to power was not in random violence, but in planned control. When he returned to Boston in 1963, Jimmy Bulger was 34 years old and ready to use what he had learned. The Boston that Jimmy Bulger returned to was a city that was changing. Big building projects were changing neighborhoods. Old neighborhoods with specific groups of people were being challenged by efforts to mix them. And the old ways of life for working people were being replaced by new ones. But in South Boston, the neighborhood was still the same, closed off, loyal, and not trusting of outsiders. Bulger moved back in with his family, acting like a changed man who had learned his lesson from his years in federal prison. To his neighbors, he was Jimmy Bulger, a local boy who had made some mistakes but was now ready to live an honest life. He got a job as a janitor and later as a clerk, keeping up the appearance of having a real job while he carefully rebuilt his criminal connections. But the Jimmy Bulger who returned to Southie was a much more dangerous man than the one who had left. His years at Alcatraz had taught him to be patient, to plan, and how important it was to have many different identities. To his family and neighbors, he was the changed ex-prisoner trying to do good. To the growing group of criminals who started to gather around him, he was a natural leader with the smarts and toughness to take them to new levels of success. Bulger's first step was to get a spot inside the existing power system of Boston's organized crime. The city's criminal world was controlled by several groups fighting for power: the Irish gangs of South Boston and Charlestown, the Italian-American Mafia families, and different smaller groups that controlled certain areas or criminal businesses. Instead of right away challenging the powerful groups, Bulger made himself a useful friend to the existing leaders. He offered his services as someone who could enforce the rules, using his reputation for being smart and violent to solve arguments and collect money that was owed. News spread quickly through Boston's criminal groups. Jimmy Bulger was back, and he was someone to watch. His relationship with his brother, Billy, meanwhile, was becoming more and more complicated. Billy Bulger had followed his own path to power, working his way up in Massachusetts politics with the same smarts and drive that Jimmy brought to crime. By the late 1960s, Billy was becoming an important person in the state Democratic Party, eventually becoming one of the most powerful politicians in Massachusetts. The Bulger brothers kept their close personal friendship, even as their work lives went in different directions. Billy never directly took part in Jimmy's criminal activities, but his political connections turned out to be very valuable to his brother's growing empire. Information about new investigations, early warnings of police raids, and special treatment from city leaders. These good things came naturally from Billy's position, even if he never clearly agreed to help his criminal brother. By the early 1970s, Jimmy Bulger had made himself an important person in South Boston's criminal world. But he saw that true power was in making smart friendships beyond his home neighborhood. The most important of these friendships would be with the Winter Hill Gang from the nearby town of Somerville. The Winter Hill Gang was led by Howie Winter, a smart criminal who had built his group into one of the most successful criminal businesses in New England. Unlike the traditional Italian-American Mafia families, which were built around family ties and loyalty to their group. Winter Hill was a place where skill mattered most. It valued smarts and getting results more than family names. Bulger saw in Winter Hill a chance to grow his business beyond the small street crimes of South Boston. The gang was involved in every kind of illegal activity that made money in the area: bookmaking, loan sharking, selling drugs, controlling unions, and armed robbery. More importantly, they had created smart ways to avoid the police's attention, including carefully building corrupt relationships inside police departments and other government offices. Howie Winter saw Bulger's potential right away. Here was a man who had respect on the street and was also truly smart, who could think about long-term goals, but was still willing to use violence when needed. Bulger's connections in South Boston also gave Winter Hill a way into new areas and new chances to make money. Their partnership started carefully, with Bulger handling certain jobs for Winter Hill while keeping his own business going in Southie. But as trust grew between the groups, Bulger found himself pulled deeper into the gang's inner circle. He was especially close to Stephen, the rifleman Flemmy, another Winter Hill member who shared Bulger's mix of smarts and toughness. Flemmy would become Bulger's closest partner in crime, a friendship that would last for decades and would in the end shape both men's futures. Like Bulger, Flemmy was a smart predator who understood that the most successful criminals were those who could work in the dark, controlling things from behind the scenes, while others took the risks and got the attention of the police. Together, Bulger and Flemmy began to build their own area of power within the Winter Hill gang. They were the experts in the most secret and dangerous jobs, getting rid of rivals, scaring witnesses, and handling situations that needed both smarts and extreme violence. Their reputation for being good at their job and quiet about it made them valuable to Winter Hill's leaders. But it also marked the start of their change from junior partners to major power players in their own right. The decision that would shape the rest of Jimmy Bulger's criminal life and in the end lead to his downfall was made in a plain FBI office in Boston in 1975. It seemed like a normal police operation. The FBI was getting informants to help them get inside organized crime in Boston. What really happened was something much more evil, the start of one of the most corrupt relationships in the history of American law enforcement. The FBI agent who talked to Bulger was John Connolly, a rising star in the FBI who had grown up in the same South Boston neighborhood as the Bulger brothers. Connolly understood how Southie worked in ways that his fellow agents never could, and he knew exactly how to talk to someone like Jimmy Bulger. The offer was simple and smart. The FBI's main target was not the Irish gangs like Winter Hill. It was the Italian-American Mafia families that had controlled organized crime in New England for decades. If Bulger would give information about the Mafia's activities, the FBI would protect him from being charged for his own crimes. It was, Connolly said, a patriotic duty helping the police take apart the foreign group that had corrupted American organized crime. For Bulger, the decision was purely about strategy. He had spent years studying how power works, first on the streets of Southie and later in the jail cells of Alcatraz. He understood that information was the most valuable thing, more valuable than money or drugs or weapons. By becoming an FBI informant, he would get the most valuable information of all, early warnings of police actions against his own group. But Bulger's relationship with the FBI was not like any other informant deal in the FBI's history. Instead of just giving information about other criminals, Bulger worked to use the relationship for his own good. He would feed the FBI carefully chosen information about his rivals, getting rid of his competition, while at the same time protecting himself from being charged. The brilliance of Bulger's plan was that it worked in two ways. To the FBI, he was a valuable source giving important information about organized crime. To his criminal friends, he was a successful gang leader who seemed to have an almost magical ability to avoid the police's attention. Neither side fully understood that they were being played by a master who was using each one against the other. Agent Connolly, meanwhile, was building his own career on the information given by his star informant. The information that Bulger gave, much of it true, though carefully chosen, helped the FBI make big cases against Mafia leaders all over New England. Connolly's success got him promotions, important jobs, and praise inside the FBI as an expert on organized crime. What Connolly either didn't understand or chose to ignore was that he was no longer controlling his informant. His informant was controlling him. Bulger had studied his handler carefully, understanding his goals, his weaknesses, and what he didn't see. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the relationship between the agent and the informant began to switch. With FBI protection acting as an almost unbreakable shield, Bulger was free to chase his goals with more aggression than ever before. The mid-1970s saw the start of a series of fights that would, in the end, make him the top criminal figure in Boston. But the path to power would be filled with amazing violence and betrayal. The first major target was the Mullins Gang, a rival Irish-American criminal group that controlled areas in South Boston that Bulger wanted. The Mullins had been a big force in Southie for years, but they had made the deadly mistake of not realizing how much. Jimmy Bulger had changed during his years with Winter Hill. The fight began over the usual criminal arguments: territory, respect, and money. But it quickly grew into something like a war. Bodies began to show up all over South Boston. They were victims of professional killings carried out with a precision that showed they were the work of experienced killers. The Mullins, used to the less polished violence of street crime, found themselves beaten by enemies who brought military-style planning and action to their work. Bulger's way of handling the gang war showed the lessons he had learned at Alcatraz and improved through his friendship with Winter Hill. Instead of using random violence, he targeted certain people whose deaths would have the biggest mental impact on his enemies while lowering the risk of them fighting back. He studied his targets carefully, learning their daily plans, their relationships, and their weaknesses before he struck. More importantly, Bulger understood that the gang war was as much about information as it was about violence. Through his FBI contacts, he had early warnings of any police interest in the fight. He knew when investigations were starting, when arrests were planned, and when it was safe to increase the violence. His enemies, meanwhile, were working blind, never knowing when they might be walking into a police trap or an attack by Bulger's men. The war with the Mullins also set the pattern that would define Bulger's criminal life. The planned killing of anyone who was a threat to his power, combined with the careful building of relationships with the police that would protect him from the results of his actions. By the end of the 1970s, the Mullins Gang had been pretty much destroyed. Its members who were still alive were either dead, in prison, or had joined Bulger's growing group. But the victory came with a price that would bother Bulger for the rest of his life. Among the people who died in the gang war were several who had been personal friends or family members of people in South Boston. The neighborhood that had once seen Jimmy Bulger as one of their own began to understand that their local boy had become something much more dangerous. A predator who was willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way, no matter who they were or what their history was. With his spot in South Boston safe, Bulger started building a criminal empire that would make huge amounts of money, while keeping up the appearance of being a community protector that was key to his power. The secret to his success was an understanding that modern organized crime was, at its heart, a business. And like any successful business, it needed careful planning, good operations, and smart thinking about long-term growth. His criminal group worked through a carefully built ladder of command that kept him from being directly involved in day-to-day criminal acts, while making sure he had control over every important operation. At the top of the pyramid was Bulger himself, along with his closest partner, Stephen Fleming. Below them were trusted helpers who were in charge of certain criminal businesses: bookmaking, loan sharking, selling drugs, and extortion. The bookmaking business was maybe the most advanced part of Bulger's empire. Instead of just taking bets on sports games, his group had created a full system that included bribing sports officials, changing the odds, and carefully managing betting limits to lower risk. The profits were huge. Millions of dollars per year went through the betting business, giving Bulger the money he needed to grow into other criminal businesses. Loan sharking was another big source of money, but it also had a strategic purpose in setting up Bulger's control over the South Boston community. By giving loans to local people who couldn't get credit from real banks, Bulger made himself look like a neighborhood helper. The fact that not paying back these loans could lead to severe violence was rarely talked about openly, but it was understood by everyone involved. Selling drugs offered both the biggest opportunity and the biggest risk for Bulger's group. The money from cocaine and other illegal drugs was much bigger than the money from traditional organized crime. But selling drugs also got the most intense attention from the police. Bulger's solution was to keep his group and the actual drug selling separate, taking money from drug dealers for permission to work in his area, while avoiding direct involvement that could get him in trouble with the law. Maybe the most profitable of all was the extortion business that Bulger built throughout South Boston and the areas around it, pretending to give protection to local businesses. His group systematically collected money from hundreds of places: bars, restaurants, construction companies, and even some real companies that had business in his area. The genius of Bulger's extortion system was in how sneaky it was. Instead of using rough threats and obvious scare tactics, he offered real protection services while making it clear that not paying would lead to serious problems. Businesses that worked with him found that their places were free from crime, their workers were safe, and their businesses ran smoothly. Those that refused to pay found out that South Boston could be a very dangerous place to do business. By the late 1970s, Jimmy Bulger's relationship with the FBI had grown far beyond the usual informant deal. What had started as a simple trade of information for protection had become something that had never happened before in the history of American law enforcement. A criminal group working under the active protection of the federal government. Agent John Connolly was no longer just handling an informant. He had become Bulger's supporter within the FBI, actively working to protect his source from investigation or being charged. When other police groups showed interest in Bulger's activities, Connolly stepped in to turn their attention somewhere else. When proof came up that might connect Bulger to serious crimes, Connolly made sure that it disappeared or was made to look fake. The corruption spread beyond Connolly to other agents in the Boston FBI office. Supervisor John Morris, who was in charge of the informant program, was regularly taking cash payments from Bulger in exchange for protecting his status as an informant. These were not small bribes. They were large payments that were like a second salary for the corrupt agents. More dangerous than the money corruption was the way the relationship had started to twist the FBI's idea of its job. Agents who should have been investigating organized crime were instead protecting one of New England's most dangerous criminals. The FBI's own files on Bulger were systematically cleaned up to remove proof of his involvement in serious crimes, while his made-up contributions as an informant were exaggerated to explain why he was still being protected. The most shocking part of the FBI's protection of Bulger was their willingness to let him commit murder while working as their informant. When information showed that Bulger was planning to get rid of rivals or possible witnesses, the FBI did nothing to stop these killings. Instead, they treated the murders as acceptable side effects in their bigger fight against the Mafia. This protection also went to Bulger's partner, Stephen Fleming, who was also working as an FBI informant. Together, the two men had a license to commit almost any crime they wanted, sure that their federal protection would keep them from facing any consequences. The deal was so complete that Bulger and Flemmy sometimes got early warnings of upcoming arrests, letting them run away or destroy evidence before the police could act. The FBI's protection of Bulger reached its most unbelievable point when he got involved in murders that directly affected ongoing federal investigations. When possible witnesses against Bulger's group were found dead, FBI agents often suspected he was involved, but made no serious effort to investigate. When informants in other cases were murdered, the FBI sometimes knew that Bulger was responsible, but chose to protect their relationship with him rather than get justice for the victims. By 1980, Jimmy Bulger had done something that no other criminal in American history had done. He had made himself essential to the police agency that should have been his main enemy. The FBI needed his information to make cases against the Mafia, and they were willing to let him operate freely in exchange for his help. It was a deal with the devil that would in the end corrupt both the criminal and the police officers who protected him. As the 1980s began, Jimmy Bulger had reached a level of power and influence that had never been seen before for a criminal working in Boston. He controlled almost every major illegal activity in South Boston, while keeping enough real connections to move freely in polite society. More importantly, he had created a public image that allowed him to be seen at the same time as a neighborhood protector and a successful businessman. The key to Bulger's public image was his ability to present himself as a keeper of South Boston's old values. In a neighborhood that valued loyalty, family, and standing up to outside interference, Bulger presented himself as the best local success story. He was the kid from the housing projects who had done well, who now used his success to help his neighbors and protect the community from outside threats. This carefully made image was supported by real acts of community help. Bulger gave money to local charities, helped families in money trouble, and stepped in to solve arguments that might have otherwise turned violent. When young people in the neighborhood got into trouble with drugs or crime, Bulger sometimes stepped in to give advice or help. These actions were real, but they also helped his bigger strategic goals by building a base of community support that made him pretty much untouchable. The most obvious sign of Bulger's status in South Boston was his relationship with local politicians, business leaders, and even some police officers who were not part of the FBI's corrupt deal. These people might have suspected that Bulger was involved in illegal activities, but they saw him mainly as a community leader who got things done. When problems came up in the neighborhood, they turned to Jimmy Bulger for solutions. Bulger's brother Billy played a key role in keeping up this respectable appearance. As Billy's political career grew, he would eventually become one of the most powerful people in Massachusetts politics. His connection with his brother gave support to Jimmy's claims of being legitimate. The fact that a respected politician kept a close relationship with Jimmy Bulger suggested to many people that the rumors about criminal activity were exaggerated or false. Behind this public image, however, Bulger was strengthening his control over Boston's criminal world through more and more advanced methods. His group had grown beyond a simple street gang to become a complex criminal business with interests all over New England. He had partnerships with other criminal groups, corrupt relationships with officials at every level of government, and an information network that was as good as those of real police agencies. The money from Bulger's criminal empire was huge. It's estimated that his group was making tens of millions of dollars per year by the mid-1980s. But money was never Bulger's main reason. Power was. He understood that in his world, money was just a tool for getting and keeping power, and power was the only guarantee of survival. By 1985, Jimmy Bulger had achieved something that most criminals only dream about. He had become the king of his territory, with no one to challenge him, protected by corrupt police, supported by his community, and feared by his enemies. He seemed untouchable, unbeatable, and beyond the reach of justice. But power, as Bulger would eventually learn, is always temporary, and the same toughness that had built his empire would in the end destroy it. The 1980s were the highest point of Jimmy Bulger's power, but they also marked the start of his change from a criminal businessman into something much more evil, a serial killer working under federal protection. The murders that Bulger committed during this time were not the result of anger or desperation, but planned killings designed to get rid of threats to his empire, while sending a message to anyone who might think about crossing him. The first major killing of this time involved Roger Wheeler, a successful businessman who owned World Jai Alai, a gambling business that made huge profits from betting on the sport of Jai Alai. Wheeler had found out that his company was being systematically robbed by criminal associates, and he was threatening to tell the police about the plan. For Bulger and his partners, Wheeler was a risk they could not accept. The murder was planned with military-like precision. Bulger's associate, John Martirano, traveled to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Wheeler was playing golf at his country club. As Wheeler left the golf course and walked to his car, Martirano shot him once in the head with a powerful rifle. The killing was so professionally done that local police at first had no clues, and it would be years before the connection to Bulger's group was made. What made the Wheeler murder especially important was not just its brutality, but the fact that it was committed with the full knowledge of Bulger's FBI handlers. The FBI knew that their informant was planning to get rid of a businessman who was a threat to his criminal business, but they made no effort to stop the killing. Instead, they treated it as an acceptable cost of keeping their relationship with Bulger. The Wheeler killing set a pattern that would be repeated throughout the 1980s. When Bulger identified someone as a threat, whether it was a rival criminal, a potential witness, or just someone who had personally crossed him, that person was marked for death. The murders were carried out with professional skill, often by associates who were experts in this type of work, and the FBI consistently failed to investigate or stop them. Among the victims was Brian Halloran, a small-time criminal who had seen Bulger's involvement in another murder and was thinking about working with the police. Instead of risking being exposed, Bulger decided to get rid of the potential witness. Halloran was shot down in broad daylight outside a restaurant in Boston, along with an innocent man who happened to be with him at the time. The Halloran murder was especially shocking because it showed Bulger's willingness to kill innocent people to protect his own interests. The second victim, Michael Donahue, was just a friend who had offered Halloran a ride. His death was accidental harm in Bulger's war against anyone who might threaten his group. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the murder of Deborah Hussey, the daughter of Stephen Fleming's girlfriend. Hussey had become a drug addict and was threatening to expose Fleming's criminal activities, possibly as revenge for sexual abuse she had suffered from him when she was younger. Instead of risking the exposure, Bulger and Fleming decided she had to die. The Hussey murder showed how deeply evil Bulger had become. This was not a rival criminal or a potential witness. This was a young woman whose only crime was being a problem for his group. Her death showed that Bulger's ability for violence had grown beyond strategic need to include anyone who was even a small threat to his interests. While the murders made headlines years later, the day-to-day work of Bulger's criminal empire was built around more normal but equally destructive activities. The extortion racket that he had developed throughout South Boston and beyond had grown into a complex system that touched almost every part of economic life in his area. The genius of Bulger's extortion operation was in how it was mixed with his public image as a community protector. Businesses that paid money to his group got real protection from crime, making sure that their employees were safe and their property was secure. Those that refused to pay found out that working in Bulger's territory could become very dangerous and expensive. The payment system worked at many levels, from small businesses paying a few $100s per month to major construction projects that brought in millions in payments over the course of their building. Bulger's group had perfected the art of figuring out exactly how much each business could afford to pay, enough to make a lot of money, but not so much as to make them go out of business. Construction companies were especially profitable targets for Bulger's extortion operation. Major building projects in Boston needed peace with the workers to stay on schedule and within budget, and Bulger's group could guarantee that peace in exchange for large payments. The developers understood that the cost of these payments was just part of doing business in Boston, included in their budgets, along with permits, materials, and real labor costs. The payment system also extended to labor unions, where Bulger's influence could decide the result of contract talks, the solving of workplace arguments, and even the choice of union leadership. By controlling key unions in the construction, transportation, and service industries, Bulger could effectively shut down economic activity throughout his territory if his demands were not met. Perhaps most sneaky was the way Bulger's group had gotten into legitimate businesses, often through forced partnerships or hidden ownership. Successful business owners might find themselves with unwanted partners who did nothing for the business but demanded a share of the profits. Those who fought these deals often found that their businesses faced a series of mysterious problems: break-ins, damage, labor arguments, or problems with rules that could be traced back to Bulger's influence. The payment system made huge profits for Bulger's group, but its true value was in the control it gave him over the economic life of his territory. Businesses that depended on his protection became invested in his continued success, creating a network of real businesses that had strong reasons to support and protect his criminal activities. By the mid-1980s, the cocaine problem was changing. Organized crime throughout the United States, and Boston was no different. The huge profits available from selling drugs created new opportunities for criminal groups, but they also attracted a lot of attention from the police and violence from competing groups. For Jimmy Bulger, the drug trade was both his greatest opportunity and his greatest challenge. Bulger's approach to the drug trade was, as usual, calculated and tough. Instead of directly involving his group in selling drugs, which would have put him under the intense federal watch that drug crimes attracted, he developed a system of taxes, an area control that allowed him to profit from the drug trade while being able to deny he was involved. The system worked like a franchise. Drug dealers who wanted to operate in Bulger's territory needed his permission and protection, which came at a high price. Major dealers paid hundreds of thousands of dollars per year for the right to operate in certain neighborhoods, while smaller dealers paid a monthly fee based on how much they sold. In return, Bulger's group gave protection from rival dealers, early warnings of police raids, and help with arguments that might otherwise turn violent. This deal made huge profits for Bulger's group while keeping him from being directly involved in selling drugs. When police investigations targeted drug dealers in his territory, they rarely found evidence connecting the dealers to Bulger himself. The payments were disguised as real business deals, and the protection services were given through middlemen, who could not directly connect Bulger to criminal activity. But the drug trade also brought new challenges that tested Bulger's ability to stay in control of his territory. Colombian and Dominican drug-selling groups were moving into Boston, bringing with them levels of violence and organization that were as good as Bulger's own. These groups had huge amounts of money, international connections, and a willingness to use extreme violence to protect their interests. The fight between Bulger's group and the new drug cartels played out in a series of brutal fights throughout the 1980s. Bodies appeared regularly in South Boston and nearby neighborhoods, victims of professional killings that showed the growing violence of the drug wars. Bulger's group was forced to adapt, becoming more like an army and more tough in response to the new threats. One of the biggest challenges came from the rise of crack cocaine. which created a new type of street-level dealer who was often too desperate or drug-addicted to respect traditional criminal power structures. These dealers sometimes operated without paying Bulger's group, or they caused public trouble that brought unwanted police attention to his territory. Bulger's response was quick and brutal. Street dealers who refused to accept his authority were killed, often in public killings designed to send a message to others who might think about challenging his control. The violence was so planned and thorough that by the late 1980s, almost every drug dealer in South Boston was either paying Bulger's group or was dead. The drug wars also gave Bulger valuable information about police activities. Drug dealers who were arrested often had information about upcoming investigations, planned raids, and the names of informants within criminal groups. By keeping relationships with these dealers, sometimes through bribes, sometimes through threats, Bulger was able to stay ahead of police efforts to get inside his group. Throughout the 1980s, as Jimmy Bulger's criminal empire reached its peak of power and violence, a strange thing happened in South Boston. The same man who was systematically murdering rivals and forcing local businesses to pay him was also being celebrated as a neighborhood hero and community protector. This was not an accident. It was the result of a carefully planned effort to create and maintain a public image that was very different from reality. The myth of Jimmy Bulger as the Robin Hood of South Boston was built on a base of selective kindness and smart public relations. Bulger made sure that his charity work was very public, while his criminal businesses remained hidden from public view. He gave money to local youth programs, helped families pay their bills during money crisis, and stepped in to solve neighborhood arguments that might have turned violent. These acts of kindness were real, but they also served a larger strategic purpose. By making himself a helper of the community, Bulger created a network of people who had personal reasons to protect and support him. Families who had received his help were not likely to cooperate with police investigations, and community leaders who had benefited from his donations were not willing to speak out against him. The myth was also supported by Bulger's ability to provide real security services to his community. South Boston had historically been troubled by drug dealing, street crime, and violence, problems that the Boston Police Department seemed unable or unwilling to solve effectively. Bulger's group, however, could guarantee that certain types of crime would not happen in their territory. Drug dealers who operated without permission were quickly killed. Muggers and burglars who preyed on local residents found themselves facing violent payback. Outsiders who came into South Boston looking for trouble discovered that the neighborhood was under the protection of people who were far more dangerous than the police. For law-abiding residents, this protection was very valuable, even if they suspected that it came from criminal sources. The difference between the myth and reality was perhaps most clear when it came to Bulger's attitude toward drugs. The public Jimmy Bulger was a strong opponent of drug dealing, especially the sale of drugs to children and young people. He was known to threaten drug dealers who sold to kids, and some were found beaten or killed after breaking his rule against selling to children. But the private Jimmy Bulger was making a huge amount of money from the drug trade through his payment system. The same dealers who were forbidden from selling to children were paying him hundreds of thousands of dollars per year for the right to operate in his territory. His opposition to drugs was selective and strategic, designed to maintain his image as a community protector while allowing him to profit from the trade. The most dangerous part of the myth was the way it provided a cover for Bulger's most serious crimes. When rivals were murdered, community members often assumed the victims must have deserved it, that they were outsiders who had threatened the neighborhood or criminals who had broken some rule of conduct. The idea that their neighborhood protector was a serial killer seemed to not fit with his public image. This willful blindness extended to some members of Bulger's own family and inner circle. People who knew him personally found it hard to believe that the Jimmy Bulger they knew smart, charming and generous to those he cared about, was the monster described in police reports. Even when evidence of his crimes became overwhelming, some people continued to believe that he was being unfairly targeted by authorities who didn't understand life in South Boston. The myth of Jimmy Bulger would ultimately prove to be both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. While it protected him from community opposition and police scrutiny for decades, it also created expectations and loyalties that would become increasingly difficult to maintain as his crimes escalated and his organization came under pressure. By the late 1980s, the relationship between Jimmy Bulger and the FBI had turned into something that was nothing like the traditional informant arrangement that was supposed to justify it. What had started as a trade of information for protection had become a criminal plot in which federal agents were active participants in murder, extortion, and obstruction of justice. The level of the FBI's corruption was stunning. Agents were not only failing to investigate Bulger's crimes, they were actively helping him commit them. When rival criminals threatened Bulger's organization, FBI agents gave him information that helped him get rid of those threats. When potential witnesses thought about cooperating with other law enforcement agencies, the FBI warned Bulger, often sealing those witnesses' fate. Agent John Connolly had become so compromised that he was basically working as a member of Bulger's organization. He accepted regular cash payments, expensive gifts, and other forms of payment in exchange for his protection and help. More importantly, he had let his professional judgment become so corrupted that he truly believed he was serving law enforcement by protecting one of New England's most dangerous criminals. The corruption spread beyond individual agents to include entire FBI operations. When the Drug Enforcement Administration launched investigations into drug trafficking in South Boston, the FBI stepped in to protect their informants' interests. When state and local police developed cases against members of Bulger's organization, federal agents found ways to weaken those investigations or turn them toward other targets. Perhaps most shocking of all was the FBI's handling of information about Bulger's murders. The Bureau kept files documenting their informants' involvement in many killings, but these files were treated as secret intelligence rather than evidence of criminal activity. Agents who knew that Bulger was a serial killer continued to protect him because they valued his information about the Mafia more than the lives of his victims. The FBI's protection of Bulger reached its most outrageous point in the case of the race-fixing scheme at World Jai Alai, when businessman Roger Wheeler was murdered for threatening to expose the scheme. FBI agents knew that their informant was responsible for the killing, but instead of investigating the murder, they helped cover it up, making sure that evidence pointing to Bulger's involvement was hidden or destroyed. The Bureau's reason for this unprecedented level of corruption was the information that Bulger provided about Italian-American organized crime families. Using information from Bulger and other informants, the FBI had successfully prosecuted several major Mafia figures, dealing devastating blows to the Mafia's operations in New England. From the Bureau's point of view, these successes justified the protection of their informants, even when those informants were committing serious crimes. But the FBI's war against the Mafia had become so all-consuming that agents lost sight of their basic job: to enforce the law fairly and protect the public. They had allowed their hatred of one criminal organization to blind them to the crimes of another, creating a situation where federal agents were essentially choosing which criminals to prosecute based on their background and willingness to cooperate. The consequences of this corruption went far beyond Bulger's own crimes. The FBI's protection of their informants had corrupted the entire criminal justice system in Boston, making it impossible for other law enforcement agencies to effectively investigate organized crime. Defense attorneys learned that they could not trust federal prosecutors, who might be protecting the very criminals their clients were accused of working with. Judges became suspicious of FBI testimony, knowing that the Bureau had a history of hiding evidence that could prove someone innocent. Most tragically, the FBI's corruption had created a climate where criminals felt they could get away with anything, which encouraged criminal violence throughout Boston. Other criminals saw that Bulger could commit murder without punishment as long as he provided information to federal agents, leading some to believe that cooperation with law enforcement was a license to commit crimes. The message sent by the FBI's protection of Bulger was clear. If you were valuable enough to the federal government, you were above the law. The corruption surrounding Jimmy Bulger spread far beyond the FBI to include a network of compromised officials at every level of government. By the late 1980s, Bulger's organization had developed relationships with corrupt police officers, prosecutors, judges, and politicians that gave them an almost unbreakable shield against law enforcement action. Local police departments were especially easy for Bulger to influence. Officers who worked in South Boston and surrounding neighborhoods found themselves caught between their official duties and the reality of Bulger's power. Those who tried to investigate his organization often found their efforts blocked by a lack of cooperation from federal agents, while those who chose to look the other way were sometimes rewarded with money or other forms of help. The corruption of individual police officers created a wider atmosphere of doubt and mistrust within law enforcement agencies. Officers who were trying to do their jobs honestly found themselves unable to tell which colleagues they could trust and which ones might be compromised. This uncertainty made it almost impossible to conduct effective investigations into Bulger's activities, since any intelligence-gathering effort might be compromised by corrupt officers who would warn Bulger of upcoming action. Prosecutors faced similar challenges, but their corruption often took more subtle forms. Instead of accepting direct bribes, some prosecutors found their careers helped by avoiding cases that might embarrass the FBI or interfere with federal investigations. Others discovered that challenging the Bureau's protection of their informants could result in a loss of cooperation on other cases, effectively ending their ability to prosecute organized crime. The judicial system was not immune to Bulger's influence, though corruption at this level was more difficult to achieve and maintain. However, the atmosphere of mistrust and conflicting loyalties that spread through law enforcement inevitably affected court cases. Judges found themselves in charge of cases where they suspected that crucial evidence was being hidden, or where the prosecution and defense seemed to be working with secret plans. Political corruption was perhaps the most complex part of Bulger's network of influence. His brother Billy's position as one of Massachusetts' most powerful politicians created a web of conflicts of interest that affected everything from law enforcement policy to city development projects. While Billy Bulger never directly took part in his brother's criminal activities, his political influence inevitably benefited Jimmy's organization in countless subtle ways. The relationship between the Bulger brothers created a unique form of institutional corruption. It was nearly impossible for outsiders to understand or fight. Billy's political allies knew that attacking Jimmy Bulger might result in payback from one of the state's most powerful politicians. Law enforcement officials who wanted Billy's support for their agencies or budgets understood that aggressively investigating his brother might put those relationships at risk. This political side of the corruption was particularly sneaky because it was mostly legal. Billy Bulger never explicitly stepped in to protect his brother's criminal activities, but his mere presence in the political system created reasons for others to avoid actions that might embarrass or compromise him. The result was a form of system-wide corruption that was far more powerful than any individual acts of bribery or intimidation. The web of corruption surrounding Bulger also extended into the private sector, where businesses and organizations that operated in his territory found themselves with strong reasons to maintain positive relationships with his organization. Defense attorneys who wanted to practice criminal law in Boston learned that certain topics were off limits and certain clients were untouchable. Journalists who investigated organized crime discovered that some stories were too dangerous to pursue, while others received unusual cooperation from sources who were normally unwilling to speak with the media. By the end of the 1980s, Jimmy Bulger had achieved something unprecedented in American organized crime. He had created a system of corruption so complete and interconnected that it was essentially immune to standard law enforcement methods. The very agencies that should have been investigating and prosecuting him had instead become his protectors, while the political and social institutions that might have provided oversight had been compromised or intimidated into silence. This system of protection would prove remarkably strong, allowing Bulger to operate with almost no consequences for more than a decade. But like all criminal enterprises built on corruption and violence, it contained the seeds of its own destruction. And those seeds would eventually grow into the forces that would bring down one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. The first serious threat to Jimmy Bulger's criminal empire came from an unexpected source: the very success of the FBI's campaign against Italian-American organized crime. By the early 1990s, the Bureau's use of informants like Bulger had destroyed the traditional Mafia families throughout New England. But this success created new problems that would ultimately expose the corruption at the heart of the FBI's operations. With the Mafia largely neutralized as a criminal force, the FBI found it increasingly difficult to justify the extraordinary protection they were providing to their informants. The intelligence that Bulger provided was becoming less valuable, while the crimes he was committing were becoming harder to ignore. More importantly, other law enforcement agencies were beginning to focus their attention on Irish-American organized crime, creating conflicts that the FBI could not easily resolve. The Massachusetts State Police had been investigating Bulger's organization for years, frustrated by what they saw as federal interference in their efforts to fight organized crime in their own state. Unlike the FBI, the state police had no reason to protect Bulger, and their investigations were beginning to produce evidence that directly contradicted the Bureau's portrayal of him as a valuable informant who was helping to fight organized crime. The first major crack in Bulger's protection came when the state police developed evidence of his involvement in the World Jai Alai murders. Working independently of federal agents, state investigators had connected Bulger's organization to the systematic looting of the gambling company and the subsequent murders of business executives who had threatened to expose the scheme. The evidence was strong, but it directly implicated an FBI informant in multiple homicides. The conflict between state and federal investigators created a situation never before seen in American law enforcement. The state police had developed a strong case against Bulger for murder and racketeering, but the FBI was actively working to protect him from prosecution. Federal agents argued that Bulger's cooperation in other cases was too valuable to sacrifice, while state investigators countered that no informant should be allowed to commit murder without consequence. The dispute reached the highest levels of both organizations, with FBI executives in Washington being forced to confront the reality of what their Boston field office had created. For the first time, Bureau officials began to understand that their agents had not simply been protecting an informant. They had been enabling a serial killer and covering up his crimes for more than a decade. Internal FBI investigations began to reveal the scope of the corruption in the Boston field office. Agent John Connolly's relationship with Bulger was examined, and investigators discovered evidence of cash payments, expensive gifts, and other forms of corruption that clearly broke federal law. More disturbing was the discovery that FBI supervisors had known about the corruption for years, but had chosen to ignore it because of the intelligence value of Bulger's cooperation. The investigation also revealed that FBI files on Bulger had been systematically falsified to hide evidence of his criminal activities. Reports that documented his involvement in murders had been changed or destroyed, while made-up accounts of his cooperation with law enforcement had been created to justify his continued protection. The scope of the cover-up was so extensive that it was impossible to determine exactly how many crimes had been concealed or how many victims had been denied justice. As the internal investigation went on, FBI officials faced a terrible choice. They could expose the full extent of the corruption and face devastating consequences for the Bureau's reputation, or they could continue the cover-up and hope that the truth would never come out. The decision they made would ultimately determine not only Bulger's fate, but the future credibility of federal law enforcement. The beginning of the end for Jimmy Bulger came in 1994 when a federal court case accidentally revealed information that would shatter the carefully built story surrounding his relationship with the FBI. During a hearing in a different case, defense attorneys got access to documents that suggested several major criminals in Boston had been serving as FBI informants while committing serious crimes. The revelation that the FBI had been protecting criminal informants created a huge stir in Boston's legal community. Defense attorneys who had been confused by their clients' convictions, while other, seemingly more dangerous criminals remained free, suddenly understood what had been happening. Prosecutors who had wondered why certain cases seemed to fall apart or why crucial evidence was sometimes unavailable began to see the pattern of FBI interference. Most importantly, the families of murder victims began to understand why their loved ones' killers had never been brought to justice. For years, they had been told that investigations into their cases were ongoing, that law enforcement was doing everything possible to solve the crimes. The truth that the FBI knew who had committed the murders, but was protecting the killers, was almost too shocking to believe. The political consequences of the revelations were immediate and devastating. Members of Congress demanded investigations into the FBI's use of criminal informants, while local politicians who had maintained friendly relationships with law enforcement found themselves under intense scrutiny. The entire criminal justice system in Boston was called into question, with judges, prosecutors, and police officials forced to confront the possibility that they had been unknowingly part of a massive cover-up. For Jimmy Bulger, the exposure of the informant program created an impossible situation. His protection from federal prosecution was disappearing, but his position as an FBI informant made him a target for every criminal organization that had suffered because of his cooperation. Former allies who had trusted him with their lives and criminal enterprises now understood that he had been betraying them to law enforcement for decades. The psychological impact on Bulger was profound. For more than 20 years, he had managed multiple identities: neighborhood protector, successful criminal, and federal informant with remarkable skill. The exposure of his FBI relationship destroyed all of these identities at once, leaving him without the foundation of lies and deception that had supported his entire adult life. Stephen Flemmi, Bulger's closest criminal partner, faced the same devastating revelation about his own informant status. The partnership that had dominated Boston, organized crime for 2 decades, was suddenly exposed as an elaborate deception orchestrated by the FBI. Both men found themselves isolated from the criminal community they had once controlled, facing potential prosecution from the federal government they had served. The collapse of Bulger's protection came remarkably quickly once the truth was exposed. FBI officials who had protected him for decades suddenly found themselves under investigation for corruption. Prosecutors who had avoided cases involving his organization were pressured to revisit their decisions. Law enforcement agencies that had been frustrated by federal interference in their investigations suddenly found themselves free to pursue cases they had been blocked from developing. But the most dangerous consequence of the exposure was the way it marked Bulger and Flemmi for death. Every criminal organization in New England now knew that these men had been informants, making them legitimate targets for elimination. Every unsolved murder, every failed criminal enterprise, every law enforcement success could potentially be traced back to their cooperation with the FBI. The walls were closing in on Jimmy Bulger from every direction. But the man who had survived decades in the violent world of organized crime was not prepared to surrender without a fight. As federal investigators began building cases against him, as former allies marked him for death, and as his entire world collapsed around him, Bulger began planning what would become one of the most daring escapes in criminal history. As Jimmy Bulger's world began to fall apart around him in the mid-1990s, his response was, as usual, violent and calculated. Faced with the exposure of his relationship with the FBI and the collapse of his criminal organization, Bulger began a final spree of murders designed to eliminate anyone who might testify against him in the trials that seemed certain to happen. The targets were carefully chosen based on their potential value as witnesses and how easy they were to attack. Former associates who knew details about specific crimes, business partners who had been involved in money laundering, and even family members of victims who might have incriminating information were all marked to be killed in Bulger's desperate attempt to avoid being convicted. The most shocking of these final murders was that of John McIntyre, a young fisherman who had become involved in Bulger's drug-selling operations. McIntyre had been arrested on different charges and was reportedly thinking about cooperating with federal prosecutors. Rather than risk the possibility that McIntyre might reveal details about the drug operation, Bulger decided to eliminate him. McIntyre was tricked into going to a house in South Boston, being told it was for a business meeting. Once there, he was questioned about his talks with law enforcement and what he knew about the organization's activities. When Bulger was sure that McIntyre was a threat, he personally strangled the young man to death. The body was buried in a basement where it would stay hidden for more than a decade. The murder of McIntyre was particularly important because it showed that Bulger's capacity for violence had reached a sick level. This was not a rival criminal or a direct threat to his organization. This was a minor figure whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The killing showed that Bulger had become so paranoid and ruthless that he was willing to murder anyone who might possibly be a threat, no matter how small. Another victim of this final period was Deborah Davis, the girlfriend of Stephen Flemmi, who had learned too much about the organization's activities. Davis had discovered evidence of Flemmi's relationship with the FBI and was threatening to expose the deal. Like so many others who had become a problem for Bulger's organization, she was murdered, and her body was disposed of in a way that kept it from being found for years. The systematic killing of potential witnesses created a climate of terror throughout Boston's criminal community. Associates of Bulger's organization understood that their knowledge of his activities had made them targets for elimination. Some fled the area, others went into hiding, and a few began cooperating with law enforcement in hopes of getting protection from the very government that had enabled Bulger's crimes for so long. But the most significant part of this final murder spree was not the number of victims or even who they were. It was the way it showed that Bulger had completely given up any pretense of being a community protector or a criminal with principles. These murders were not committed to defend territory or maintain criminal discipline. They were the acts of a desperate man who was willing to kill anyone who might threaten his freedom. The psychological transformation was complete. The intelligent, calculating criminal who had once ruled Boston through a combination of violence and political smarts had become a serial killer whose only concern was his own survival. The community that had once protected him now feared him, and the criminal organization that had once respected his leadership now saw him as a problem that had to be eliminated. In December 1994, as federal prosecutors were finalizing charges that would accuse Jimmy Bulger of racketeering, extortion, and multiple murders, retired FBI agent John Connolly made a decision that would define the rest of his own life and start one of the most intense manhunts in American history. Even though he was officially retired from the FBI, Connolly still felt an emotional and financial connection to protecting his former informant. When he learned that Bulger was about to be arrested, he decided to warn him. The tip-off came through a middleman. Connolly contacted his former supervisor, John Morris, who, despite his own corruption, had remained with the FBI. Morris, in turn, passed the warning to Bulger through channels that the organization had used for years to receive intelligence from their federal protectors. The message was simple. Indictments were being prepared, arrests were about to happen, and anyone who wanted to avoid prosecution had better disappear immediately. For Bulger, the warning was both a salvation and a disaster. It gave him the opportunity to escape prosecution, but it also marked the end of everything he had built over more than 3 decades in organized crime. The empire he had constructed in South Boston, the relationships that had sustained his power, the identity he had carefully crafted as a community leader, all of it would have to be abandoned in exchange for freedom. The decision to flee was made quickly, but carried out with characteristic planning and attention to detail. Bulger had always understood that his criminal career might end in either death or prison, and he had made preparations for the possibility that he might need to disappear on short notice. Cash had been hidden in various locations, fake identities had been prepared, and safe houses had been set up in places far from Boston. On December 23, 1994, Jimmy Bulger simply vanished. He left behind his apartment in South Boston, his legitimate business interests, and his entire criminal organization. Most significantly, he left behind the community that had protected and supported him throughout his criminal career, the neighborhood that had made his rise to power possible. But he did not leave alone. Catherine Grieg, a dental hygienist who had been Bulger's girlfriend for several years, chose to go with him into exile. Grieg's decision to flee with Bulger was remarkable. She was abandoning her own life, her family, her profession, and her future to share the uncertain fate of America's most wanted fugitive. The escape was initially successful, beyond Bulger's wildest hopes. Despite a massive FBI manhunt that would eventually cost millions of dollars and involve hundreds of agents, Bulger and Grieg managed to establish new identities and disappear into the vast anonymity of American society. They had become ghosts, invisible to the law enforcement apparatus that had once protected them. The manhunt that followed Bulger's disappearance became one of the most extensive in FBI history, second only to the search for Osama bin Laden. Agents followed leads across the United States and around the world, pursuing sightings that led them to locations as diverse as California, Louisiana, New York, Ireland, and South America. But Bulger seemed to have achieved the impossible. He had become completely invisible to the massive law enforcement apparatus that was searching for him. The irony was not lost on FBI officials, who understood the history of Bulger's relationship with their agency. The same man who had been protected by federal agents for decades was now their most wanted target, and the skills he had learned from his law enforcement contacts were proving invaluable in helping him evade capture. Bulger understood how the FBI operated, how they conducted investigations, and how they tracked fugitives, because he had been on the inside of their operations for most of his adult life. The 16 years that Jimmy Bulger and Catherine Grieg spent on the run represented one of the most successful disappearances in criminal history. But they also revealed the psychological toll that life in hiding takes on even the most hardened criminals. The couple who had once lived at the center of Boston's criminal underworld found themselves reduced to the existence of elderly retirees, invisible and isolated in communities where no one knew their true identities. Their life as fugitives began in New York City, where they established their first fake identities and learned the basic skills of living under assumed names. Bulger became Charles Gosco, while Grieg took the name Carol Gosco, and they presented themselves as a retired married couple from Chicago. The identities were sophisticated, complete with social security numbers, driver's licenses, and the kinds of documentation that would allow them to rent apartments, open bank accounts, and blend into their new communities. From New York, they moved frequently, never staying in one location long enough to establish the kinds of relationships that might lead to their identification. They lived in modest apartments in middle-class neighborhoods, choosing locations that were neither so fancy as to attract attention nor so run down as to be unsafe. The key to their success was their ability to become completely ordinary, to transform themselves from notorious criminals into forgettable senior citizens. The mental adjustment required for this transformation was extraordinary. Bulger, who had spent decades as one of the most feared and respected criminals in New England, had to learn to be a nobody. He could not use the intelligence, charisma, and ruthlessness that had defined his criminal career, because any display of these qualities might attract attention that could lead to his capture. Catherine Grieg's adjustment was perhaps even more remarkable. She had voluntarily abandoned a successful professional career and a stable life to share the uncertain fate of a fugitive. The woman who had once been a respected member of her community in Boston had to learn to live without any community at all, completely dependent on a man whose criminal activities had made them both targets of the largest manhunt in American history. The couple developed routines and habits that minimized their exposure to discovery, while maintaining some semblance of a normal life. They shopped at large chain stores where cashiers were unlikely to remember them, paid for everything in cash to avoid creating paper trails, and avoided the kinds of social interactions that might lead to friendships or relationships that could expose their true identities. But isolation came at a tremendous psychological cost. Bulger, who had thrived on power and control, found himself powerless and irrelevant. The man who had once decided who lived and died in South Boston was reduced to watching television and reading newspapers to follow the consequences of his former life. The community that had once feared and respected him had moved on, and his former associates were either dead, in prison, or cooperating with the authorities who continued to search for him. The manhunt itself became a constant source of stress and paranoia. FBI agents appeared regularly on television, asking for information about the fugitives, and their photographs were displayed in post offices and other public buildings throughout the country. Every knock on the door, every unexpected visitor, every unusual event in their neighborhood could potentially be the end of their freedom. As the years passed, the psychological pressure began to take its toll on both fugitives. Bulger, who had once been a master of manipulation and control, became increasingly paranoid and isolated. He trusted no one completely, not even Catherine Grieg, and he developed elaborate security procedures designed to detect any sign that their true identities had been discovered. Grieg, meanwhile, struggled with the complete absence of the life she had known before their flight. She had no contact with her family, no professional identity, and no social connections beyond her relationship with Bulger. The woman who had once been an active member of her community was reduced to a completely dependent existence that offered no opportunities for personal growth or satisfaction. By 2010, the FBI's search for Jimmy Bulger had become something of an embarrassment for the Bureau. 16 years had passed since his escape, and despite spending millions of dollars and deploying hundreds of agents, law enforcement had been unable to locate America's most wanted fugitive. The case had become a symbol of FBI incompetence, a reminder of the corruption that had enabled Bulger's crimes and the failure of federal law enforcement to bring him to justice. The breakthrough came through a combination of new technology and old-fashioned detective work. FBI agents had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for tracking fugitives, including advanced computer databases that could identify patterns in credit card usage, rental agreements, and other financial transactions. More importantly, they had learned to focus their efforts on the support networks that enabled fugitives to maintain their false identities. The key insight was that Catherine Grieg represented Bulger's greatest vulnerability. While Bulger himself had learned to live without any connections to his former life, Grieg had maintained certain habits and preferences that could potentially be traced. She was known to care a lot about her appearance, regularly visiting beauty salons for expensive treatments. She was also devoted to her pets, particularly her dogs, and would require veterinary services wherever she lived. FBI analysts began focusing their search on nice neighborhoods in warm cities, where an elderly couple with a lot of money and no apparent job might choose to live. They developed profiles of the kinds of services that Grieg would be likely to use and the types of places where the couple might be customers. The breakthrough came in 2011 when FBI agents decided to launch a targeted publicity campaign focused specifically on Catherine Grieg. Instead of just showing Bulger's photograph and hoping for tips, they created a media campaign that emphasized Grieg's distinctive appearance and her likely habits. The campaign included age-progressed photographs, showing how she might look after 16 years as a fugitive, and it specifically targeted the kinds of businesses where she might be a customer. The strategy worked almost immediately. Within days of the campaign's launch, the FBI received a tip from a woman in Santa Monica, California, who recognized Catherine Grieg from the photographs. The tipster had noticed an elderly couple who lived quietly in her apartment building, keeping to themselves, but occasionally seen walking their pets or shopping in the neighborhood. The woman's description matched the FBI's profile perfectly. A well-dressed elderly couple with no apparent job but a lot of money. FBI agents who investigated the tip quickly confirmed that they had found their targets. The couple living in apartment 303 of the Princess Eugenia Apartments were indeed Jimmy Bulger and Catherine Grieg. Living under the identities of Charles and Carol Gasco, they had been hiding in plain sight for more than a decade. Just another elderly couple among the many retirees who had chosen Santa Monica as their final home. The irony was overwhelming. The man who had spent decades evading capture through sophisticated criminal intelligence networks had been discovered by a simple television advertisement and an observant neighbor. The same FBI that had protected him for so long had finally found him using the most basic tools of law: enforcement, publicity, and citizen cooperation. On the morning of June 22, 2011, FBI Special Agent Scott Garriola and his team positioned themselves around the Princess Eugenia Apartments in Santa Monica, preparing to end one of the longest manhunts in American history. The operation required careful planning. Bulger was known to be armed and dangerous, and there was always the possibility that he might choose to go out in a blaze of gunfire, rather than surrender to the authorities who had once been his protectors. The agents had studied their target carefully, learning his routines and identifying the best opportunity to approach him without creating a dangerous situation for innocent people. Bulger and Grieg typically took evening walks around the neighborhood, but they also made regular trips to the parking garage beneath their apartment building. The garage offered the best opportunity for an arrest. It was enclosed, relatively private, and would minimize the risk to bystanders. As Bulger and Grieg walked toward their white Ford sedan that evening, they appeared to be just another elderly couple heading out for dinner or an evening drive. Bulger wore casual clothes and walked slowly, his arm around Grieg in a gesture that seemed protective and affectionate. There was nothing in their appearance to suggest that they were two of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Agent Garriola approached, the couple with professional calm, his weapon ready but not drawn. The moment he had been preparing for throughout his career was finally at hand: the capture of a legendary criminal who had eluded law enforcement for more than 16 years. Behind him, other agents moved into position, blocking all possible escape routes and ensuring that their targets could not flee. James Bulger. His voice echoed through the parking garage. The old man stopped walking and turned toward the agent. For a moment, his pale blue eyes, those same cold, calculating eyes that had been the last thing many of his victims had seen, met Garriola's gaze. There was no surprise there, no panic, no fear. Only a kind of weary resignation, as if he had always known this moment would come. "You know who I am," Bulger replied quietly. Those words marked the end of Jimmy Bulger's life as a free man. Agents quickly searched him and discovered that he was carrying multiple weapons, including loaded pistols and a large amount of cash. In their apartment, investigators would later find an arsenal of weapons, hundreds of thousands of dollars, in cash and false identification documents that had allowed them to live undetected for more than a decade. Catherine Grieg was arrested alongside Bulger, her 16-year journey as a fugitive coming to an end in the same Santa Monica parking garage. The woman who had abandoned everything to share the fate of America's most wanted criminal now faced the consequences of that decision. Federal charges that would likely result in a lengthy prison sentence. The arrest created a media sensation that spread far beyond Boston. News crews descended on Santa Monica, while reporters in Boston interviewed former FBI agents, prosecutors, and family members of Bulger's victims. The story had everything that captured public attention: corruption, violence, betrayal, and the dramatic conclusion of a manhunt that had lasted nearly 2 decades. But for the families of Bulger's victims, the arrest represented something more profound than a media spectacle. For the first time in decades, they had hoped that the man who had murdered their loved ones might finally face justice for his crimes. The FBI's protection of Bulger had denied them that possibility for so long that many had given up hope of ever seeing him brought to trial. The transfer of Jimmy Bulger from California to Massachusetts marked the beginning of the final act in one of the most extraordinary criminal careers in American history. As the federal prisoner transport aircraft touched down at Logan International Airport in Boston, the 81-year-old man who had once ruled the city's underworld returned to face judgment for crimes that had terrorized the region for more than 3 decades. The Boston that greeted Bulger's return was vastly different from the city he had fled in 1994. South, Boston had been transformed by new development, with expensive condominiums replacing the housing projects where Bulger had grown up. The Irish-American political machine that his brother Billy had helped build was in decline, replaced by a more diverse political landscape that reflected the city's changing demographics. Most significantly, the culture of silence that had protected Bulger for so long was breaking down. The exposure of his relationship with the FBI had shattered the myth that had portrayed him as a neighborhood protector. Former associates who had once been too afraid to speak against him were now cooperating with prosecutors, eager to distance themselves from his crimes and avoid their own prosecution. The federal courthouse in Boston became the center of intense media attention as prosecutors prepared their case against Bulger. The charges were staggering in their scope: racketeering, extortion, money laundering, drug trafficking, and 19 counts of murder. The indictment read like a catalog of nearly every serious crime imaginable, the accumulated evidence of a criminal career that had spanned more than 4 decades. But the most significant aspect of his return was not the legal proceedings. It was the psychological impact on the community he had once controlled. For decades, the people of South Boston had lived with the knowledge that their neighborhood was ruled by a man who was capable of extraordinary violence. His arrest and return to face trial represented a kind of liberation, the end of an era of fear and intimidation. The preparation for trial revealed the full extent of the FBI's corruption and cover-up. Prosecutors had to navigate through decades of destroyed evidence, falsified reports, and witness intimidation to build their case. Many potential witnesses were dead, victims of Bulger's paranoid elimination of anyone who might testify against him. Others were too afraid to come forward, even with Bulger in custody, because they feared retaliation from his remaining associates. The legal team that assembled to prosecute Bulger represented some of the most experienced federal prosecutors in the country. They understood that this case was about more than just convicting one criminal. It was about restoring faith in the justice system after decades of corruption had made a mockery of law enforcement. The trial would be watched not just by the people of Boston, but by law enforcement professionals throughout the country who needed to see that even the most protected criminals could eventually be brought to justice. The trial of James Whitey Bulger began on June 12, 2013, in the federal courthouse in Boston, nearly 19 years after he fled from justice. The proceedings would last for 2 months, during which prosecutors would present evidence spanning more than 3 decades of criminal activity. For many observers, the trial represented not just the prosecution of an individual criminal, but a moment to deal with the institutional corruption that had enabled his crimes. Judge Denise Casper oversaw the proceedings with careful attention to ensuring that Bulger received a fair trial, despite the enormous publicity surrounding his case. The selection of an unbiased jury had been challenging, given that almost everyone in the Boston area had some knowledge of Bulger's crimes and the FBI corruption that had protected him. Ultimately, 12 jurors and 6 alternates were chosen from a pool of potential jurors who had been carefully screened for bias and preconceived ideas. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Brian Kelly, painted a picture of Bulger as a ruthless killer who had used his FBI protection to eliminate rivals and witnesses while building a criminal empire based on fear and violence. Kelly methodically outlined the charges against Bulger, describing specific murders, extortions, and other crimes that prosecutors intended to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Perhaps most dramatically, Kelly addressed the main issue in the room: Bulger's relationship with the FBI. Instead of trying to downplay or excuse the Bureau's corruption, the prosecution acknowledged it directly, while arguing that it did not excuse Bulger's crimes. The fact that federal agents had protected him, Kelly argued, made his crimes even more terrible because he had used the authority of law enforcement to shield his criminal activities. The defense strategy, led by attorney J.W. Carney Jr., was both bold and problematic. Instead of denying Bulger's involvement in criminal activities, the defense argued that he had been given immunity by the federal government in exchange for his cooperation as an informant. Carney claimed that Bulger had been authorized by the FBI to commit crimes as part of his undercover role, making his prosecution a violation of that agreement. This defense strategy was legally problematic because no prosecutor or FBI agent has the authority to grant immunity for murder, and no informant agreement could legally authorize someone to commit serious crimes. But it served the defense's larger purpose of putting the FBI's conduct on trial alongside Bulger himself, potentially creating reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors, who might be sympathetic to the argument that Bulger had been betrayed by the government that had once protected him. The most controversial aspect of the defense strategy was Carney's decision to acknowledge that Bulger had been an FBI informant while denying that he had committed murders. This approach directly contradicted Bulger's own wishes. He had spent decades cultivating an image as someone who would never cooperate with law enforcement, and the revelation of his informant status had already destroyed that reputation. But Carney believed it was the only workable defense strategy, given the overwhelming evidence of Bulger's criminal activities. The prosecution's case against Jimmy Bulger was built around the testimony of former associates who had witnessed his crimes firsthand. These witnesses, many of them criminals themselves, who had received immunity or reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation, painted a picture of systematic violence and intimidation that shocked even experienced court observers. John Martorano, a professional killer who had worked for Bulger's organization, confessed to 20 murders during his testimony, with matter-of-fact precision. He described how he had eliminated rivals, witnesses, and anyone else who posed a threat to Bulger's criminal empire. Martirano's testimony was particularly devastating because he could provide specific details about the planning, execution, and disposal of bodies that could only have come from direct participation in the crimes. Perhaps most shocking was Martirano's account of the murder of Roger Wheeler, the businessman who had discovered that his World Jai Ally company was being looted by criminal associates. Martirano described traveling to Tulsa, Oklahoma, waiting for Wheeler to finish playing golf, and then shooting him in the head as he approached his car. The murder had been planned with military precision, and Martirano's testimony revealed how Bulger's organization had evolved from street-level criminals to sophisticated killers capable of operating anywhere in the country. Stephen Flemmi, Bulger's closest criminal partner for more than 2 decades, provided testimony that was even more damaging. Flemmi had been present during many of Bulger's most serious crimes, and his detailed knowledge of the organization's operations allowed prosecutors to connect Bulger directly to specific murders, extortions, and other criminal activities. Flemmi's testimony was particularly devastating when he described the murders of women who had become inconvenient to the organization. He detailed the killing of Deborah Hussey, his own girlfriend's daughter, who had threatened to expose their criminal activities. With a cold and distant manner, he described how Bulger had strangled the young woman and how they had disposed of her body in a way that prevented its discovery for years. The testimony about the murder of Deborah Davis, another young woman who had learned too much about the organization's activities, was equally horrific. Flemmi described how Davis had been lured to a house in South Boston, where she was strangled and buried. The casual way in which he described these murders as necessary business decisions rather than acts of extreme violence illustrated the depth of moral corruption that had characterized Bulger's organization. Kevin Weeks, who had served as Bulger's right-hand man in South Boston, provided crucial testimony about the day-to-day operations of the criminal enterprise. Weeks had been responsible for collecting payments from local businesses, overseeing drug trafficking operations, and carrying out acts of intimidation and violence on Bulger's behalf. His testimony revealed the systematic nature of the extortion that had terrorized the South Boston business community for decades. Perhaps most significantly, Weeks led investigators to burial sites where several of Bulger's victims had been hidden for years. The discovery of these bodies provided physical evidence that confirmed the witness testimony and demonstrated the true scope of Bulger's violence. For the families of the victims, the recovery of remains provided a measure of closure after decades of uncertainty about the fate of their loved ones. One of the most powerful aspects of Bulger's trial was the opportunity it provided for the families of his victims to finally confront the man who had destroyed their lives. Victim impact statements allowed family members to describe the devastating consequences of Bulger's crimes, not just for those who were killed, but for the parents, children, spouses, and siblings who had been left behind to grieve. Patricia Donahue, whose husband Michael had been killed alongside Brian Halloran in 1982, described decades of struggling to raise her children as a single mother while wondering why her husband's killer had never been brought to justice. Her testimony revealed the secondary victimization that occurs when the justice system fails to function properly, the way that FBI corruption had denied her family closure and accountability for more than 30 years. The testimony of family members was particularly moving because it humanized victims who had often been dismissed by law enforcement as criminals who deserved their fate. Many of Bulger's victims had indeed been involved in criminal activities, but their families' testimony reminded the court that they were also human beings, fathers, sons, brothers, and friends whose deaths had left permanent scars on those who loved them. Stephen Davis, whose sister Deborah had been murdered by Bulger and Flemmy, confronted Bulger directly during his testimony. With tears in his eyes, he described learning about his sister's death not from law enforcement, but from reading about it in newspaper accounts of the trial. For more than 20 years, he had believed that his sister was still alive somewhere, possibly living under an assumed name. The discovery that she had been murdered and buried shortly after her disappearance was almost too devastating to comprehend. The family members also described the broader impact of Bulger's crimes on their community. South Boston had lived under a cloud of fear for decades, with residents understanding that certain topics were off limits and certain people were untouchable. The psychological terrorism that Bulger had imposed on his own neighborhood was perhaps his most lasting crime, creating a culture of silence and intimidation that had persisted long after he fled from Boston. Some family members expressed anger, not just at Bulger, but at the FBI agents who had protected him while knowing that he was committing murders. For these families, the revelation that federal law enforcement had enabled their loved ones' killer was almost as devastating as the murders themselves. They had trusted the justice system to protect them and seek accountability for crimes against their families, only to discover that the system had been corrupted to protect the very criminal who had destroyed their lives. Jimmy Bulger's decision not to testify in his own defense represented the final collapse of his legal strategy and his public persona. Throughout the trial, his attorney, J.W. Carney Jr., had promised that Bulger would take the stand to deny the murder charges and explain his relationship with the FBI. When that testimony never happened, it became clear that even Bulger understood that his lies could no longer protect him. The defense's strategy had been built around the claim that Bulger had been given immunity by the FBI in exchange for his cooperation as an informant. But this argument faced legal hurdles that were impossible to overcome. No government agent has the authority to grant immunity for murder, and no legitimate informant agreement could authorize someone to commit serious crimes without punishment. More fundamentally, the defense strategy required the jury to believe that Bulger had been a legitimate law enforcement asset, whose cooperation had served the public interest. The evidence presented during the trial made this argument impossible to sustain. Witness after witness had testified that Bulger's cooperation with the FBI consisted primarily of eliminating rivals and strengthening his own power, with any intelligence value being secondary to his personal criminal goals. The defense's attempts to portray Bulger as a victim of FBI corruption also failed to connect with the jurors. While there was overwhelming evidence of corruption within the Boston FBI office, this did not excuse or justify Bulger's crimes. If anything, his manipulation of federal agents made his crimes more serious, not less, because he had corrupted the institutions that were supposed to protect society from criminals like himself. Bulger's refusal to testify was particularly damaging because it meant that his denials of the murder charges were never presented under oath or subjected to cross-examination. The jury was left with the unchallenged testimony of multiple witnesses who had described his personal involvement in planning and executing murders, with no contrary evidence other than the general denials contained in his attorney's opening statement. The collapse of the defense strategy was visible in Carney's closing argument, which focused more on attacking the credibility of government witnesses than on presenting a coherent alternative theory of the case. While it was true that many of the prosecution's witnesses were criminals who had received favorable treatment in exchange for their cooperation, their testimony was supported by physical evidence, FBI documents, and the testimony of victims' family members. Perhaps most significantly, the defense was unable to explain away the enormous arsenal of weapons and cash that had been found in Bulger's Santa Monica apartment. This evidence showed that even during his years as a fugitive, Bulger had remained prepared for violence and had access to the profits from his criminal empire. For an 81-year-old man who claimed to be a legitimate informant, wrongfully accused of crimes, the continued possession of military-style weapons was impossible to justify. On August 12, 2013, after 5 days of discussion, the jury returned their verdict in the case of United States v. James J. Bulger. The jury leader rose and delivered the words that victims, families had been waiting to hear for decades. Guilty. Bulger was found guilty on 31 of the 32 charges in the indictment, including racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and weapons charges. Most importantly, the jury found that Bulger had taken part in 11 murders, while choosing not to make a decision on 8 others, because there was not enough evidence. The murder convictions covered a period of almost 2 decades, from the 1970s through the 1990s, showing the continuous nature of his violence and the planned way he had gotten rid of anyone who threatened his criminal empire. The verdict was a complete rejection of the defense's claims about FBI, immunity, and authorized cooperation. The jury had decided that no matter what Bulger's relationship with federal agents was, he was responsible for his own criminal choices and could not escape accountability by blaming the corruption of his handlers. Judge Denise Casper set the sentencing for November 14, 2013, giving prosecutors and defense attorneys time to prepare their arguments about the right punishment for Bulger's crimes. Under federal sentencing rules, the murder convictions alone were enough to justify life in prison. But the prosecution was asking for additional penalties that would make sure he could never be released from prison. The sentencing hearing gave another chance for victims' families to speak directly to Bulger and describe the impact of his crimes on their lives. Many family members had waited decades for this moment, a chance to look their loved one's killer in the eye and hold him responsible for the destruction he had caused. Patricia Donahue, whose husband Michael had been killed in 1982, spoke directly to Bulger about the impact of his crimes on her family. "You're a domestic terrorist," she told him, her voice steady despite years of sadness and anger. "You killed my husband and left me to raise my 3 children alone." Her words captured not just her personal suffering, but the wider impact of Bulger's reign of terror on the South Boston community. Stephen Davis, whose sister Deborah had been murdered by Bulger and Stephen Fleming, also spoke to the court. He described learning about his sister's death through newspaper coverage of the trial, decades after she had disappeared. "You're a punk," he told Bulger. "You killed women. You killed innocent people. You're nothing but a coward." When given the chance to speak to the court before sentencing, Bulger made a brief statement that showed he still felt no remorse for his crimes. Instead of apologizing to the victims' families or taking responsibility for his actions, he complained about the conditions of his jail cell and insisted he was innocent, despite the jury's verdict. Judge Casper sentenced Bulger to 2 life sentences to be served one after the other, plus 5 years in prison. The sentence made sure that the 84-year-old defendant would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of parole or release. It was, the judge noted, a fitting punishment for crimes that had terrorized an entire community and corrupted the institutions of law enforcement. On October 30th, 2018, James Whitey Bulger was found dead in his cell at the United States Penitentiary Hazleton in West Virginia. He had been transferred to the prison just 12 hours earlier, barely enough time to learn the layout of his new surroundings before meeting his violent end. The man who had survived decades in the brutal world of organized crime, who had avoided capture for 16 years as America's most wanted fugitive, had finally met the fate that had always seemed certain for someone who had lived by violence. The details of Bulger's death were as brutal and calculated as the murders he had committed throughout his criminal career. Fellow inmates Focios Freddie Guess and Paul J. Decologero, both serving life sentences for murder, attacked Bulger in his cell using homemade weapons. The assault was swift and deadly. Bulger was beaten so severely that he died within hours of the attack. The murder appeared to be motivated by a combination of factors that had made Bulger a marked man within the federal prison system. His reputation as an FBI informant made him a target for inmates who saw cooperation with law enforcement as the ultimate betrayal. His advanced age and weak condition made him vulnerable to predators who saw him as an easy target. Most significantly, his decades of violence had created enemies throughout the criminal underworld who had been waiting for an opportunity to settle old scores. For the families of Bulger's victims, his death brought a complex mix of emotions. Some felt a sense of justice that the man who had killed their loved ones had finally received the violent end that his crimes deserved. Others felt cheated of the opportunity to see him serve out his life sentence, to know that he was suffering the consequences of his actions every day he remained in prison. The investigation into Bulger's murder revealed the same institutional failures that had marked his entire relationship with the federal justice system. Prison officials had known that Bulger was at risk because of his reputation as an informant, but they had failed to take proper steps to protect him. His transfer to a facility where he would be vulnerable to attack seemed almost deliberately careless, leading to speculation that officials had either intentionally exposed him to danger or had been criminally negligent in their handling of a high-profile inmate. The death of Jimmy Bulger marked the end of an individual criminal career, but it did not erase the institutional damage that his corruption had caused throughout the American justice system. The FBI's protection of Bulger had revealed fundamental flaws in the way federal law enforcement agencies operated, flaws that continued to affect the Bureau's credibility and effectiveness long after his death. The corruption that had enabled Bulger's crimes extended far beyond the individual agents who had taken his bribes or covered up his murders. It represented a systematic failure of supervision, accountability, and institutional culture that had allowed criminal behavior to thrive within one of America's most respected law enforcement agencies. The consequences of that failure continued to ripple through the justice system, affecting everything from the prosecution of organized crime to the public's trust in federal law enforcement. Agent John Connolly, the FBI handler who had protected Bulger for decades, was eventually convicted of racketeering and obstruction of justice. He received a 40-year federal sentence that would likely ensure he died in prison, making him one of the few law enforcement officials to face serious consequences for the corruption that had enabled Bulger's crimes. His prosecution sent a message that even federal agents were not above the law, but it came decades too late to help the victims of the crimes he had helped conceal. The broader reforms that followed the exposure of the FBI's corruption included new policies governing the use of criminal informants, increased oversight of field operations, and mandatory reporting requirements designed to prevent the kind of cover-ups that had protected Bulger. But critics argued that these reforms addressed only the symptoms of the problem, not the underlying culture that had allowed the corruption to flourish in the first place. The transformation of South Boston in the decades following Bulger's flight reflected broader changes in American city life. The neighborhood that had once been defined by its isolation and resistance to outside authority had been redeveloped beyond recognition, with expensive condominiums replacing the housing projects where Bulger had grown up. The Irish-American political machine that had enabled his rise to power had been largely dismantled, replaced by a more diverse and transparent system of government. But the psychological scars left by Bulger's reign of terror proved more difficult to erase. Older residents of South Boston continued to speak in hushed tones about the years when Jimmy Bulger had ruled their neighborhood through fear and violence. The culture of silence that had protected him remained partially intact, even after his death, as people struggled to reconcile their memories of a man who had been both protector and predator. The families of Bulger's victims found varying degrees of closure in his conviction and death. Some were able to move forward, finally able to grieve properly after decades of uncertainty about their loved one's fate. Others remained consumed by anger at a justice system that had failed them so completely and had protected their family's killer while denying them the truth about his crimes. Perhaps most significantly, the Bulger case served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing law enforcement agencies to operate without proper oversight or accountability. The FBI's protection of a serial killer in the name of fighting organized crime represented the worst possible outcome of an ends justify the means mentality that had corrupted the FBI's mission and betrayed the public trust. The story of Jimmy Bulger, from his childhood in the projects of South Boston to his death in a federal prison cell, represents one of the most extraordinary criminal careers in American history. But it also represents something more troubling, a systematic failure of the institutions that are supposed to protect society from people like him. The fact that he was able to operate with almost no consequences for decades, protected by the very agents who should have been investigating his crimes, reveals flaws in the American justice system that extend far beyond any single case. In the end, Jimmy Bulger got what he had always given: violence delivered without mercy or remorse. But the broader lessons of his life and crimes remain relevant for anyone who seeks to understand how corruption can flourish when institutions fail in their fundamental responsibilities, and how the pursuit of justice can be twisted when those in charge of enforcing the law place their own interests above the public good. The King of Boston was finally dead, but the kingdom he had built through corruption and violence left scars that would take generations to heal. His story serves as a permanent reminder that in a society governed by laws, no one, not even those who claim to serve justice, can be allowed to place themselves above the law without ultimately destroying the very foundations of civilized society. What shocked you most about this complete story of corruption, violence, and the price of unchecked power? Let me know in the comments below. What part of Whitey Bulger's incredible true story left the biggest impression on you? If this deep look into one of America's most notorious criminals kept you engaged for the full journey, smash that like button and let me know it was worth the time. Subscribe for more complete true crime documentaries that dig deep into the stories that shaped American criminal history. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the cases that reveal the darkest corners of human nature and institutional failure. Share this with fellow true crime fans. Stories like Whitey Bulger's need to be told, not just for their entertainment value, but as warnings about what happens when corruption goes unchecked and justice is twisted by those sworn to uphold it. Thanks for spending these hours with me, exploring one of the most shocking criminal sagas in American history. The story of Jimmy Bulger shows us that even the most powerful criminals eventually face judgment, even if it takes decades and costs countless lives along the way. I'll see you in the next investigation, where we'll continue to uncover the truth behind the cases that reveal the complex relationships between crime, corruption, and justice in America. The irony was not lost on FBI officials, who understood the history of Bulger's relationship with their agency. The same man who had been protected by federal agents for decades was now their most wanted target, and the skills he had learned from his law enforcement contacts were proving invaluable in helping him evade capture. Bulger understood how the FBI operated, how they conducted investigations, and how they tracked fugitives, because he had been on the inside of their operations for most of his adult life.